Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I will be talking about what I read in November and December. I didn't really do a wrap-up for November, and a lot of that was because I felt like I had a lot of books that I still wanted to finish reading. The majority of what I read I actually talked about in my vlogs, which I have part 1 and 2 up for. I don't have part 3. I'm not sure if I'm actually going to put part 3 up because a lot of it was like angst and dissociating, like my brain was kind of mush and like I said things and I did things, but a lot of it was rambling and some of it was not as coherent as I would like it to be. So that's just not going to be on there. But I'm coming to you now to talk about all of that. I'm going to go through all of the books that I read in November and December, and then I'll talk about a couple of the books that I started. Editing back here because November felt like approximately 100 years ago, and I completely forgot to mention the Indigathon, which I participated in the month of November. If you don't know what the Indigathon is, definitely check out the links to all of it in the description. The focus of it is to read books by Indigenous authors. I started out November with a lot of graphic novels and picture books because it was the Graphicathon. The first thing that I read in November was Queer, A Graphic History, and I was really impressed by this. I didn't totally know what to expect. I thought it would be a very basic LGBT history, but it actually talks about the history of the queer movement and queer theory. So of course that's like LGBT, but it's a more specific part of the LGBT movement. I was super impressed and I really enjoyed it. It definitely got me back into thinking about queer theory, which I've studied before, but I really wanted to get into in more detail. Now this, of course, doesn't go super deep into detail on one thing because it is an overview, but it's definitely a good starting point for if you kind of want to know what direction to go in with your reading. I'm actually considering buying a copy of this for myself. I borrowed it from the library. If you want to know more in-depth details about this book, or a lot of the next books that I'm going to be mentioning, you could definitely check out my vlog that I mentioned. The next thing that I read was My Solo Exchange Diary Volume 2 by Nagata Kabi. This is the third memoir manga that she has put out. The first one is My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, and she's coming out with a 4th part next year that I'm really excited for. I really enjoyed this. In general, I liked her discussion about friendships. I like that in all of this she is very open about her mental health, and I also like that she talks about the experience of having a memoir or like a piece of yourself out there like that. I go more into detail in my vlog, but I really enjoyed that. The next book that I read for the Graphicathon was actually a reread, and that is Roadqueen, An Eternal Road Trip to Love, and I've talked about this several times recently, actually. This is really a lot of fluff. It's a fake dating, enemies to lovers, really sweet. It was a joy to reread. The next several books that I read were all children's books. I went through and read a number of them when we were super dead at work. I think it was the night of the election. So I'll go through and I'll say the name and the title and maybe a little bit about what I thought about it. But if you want more details of my thoughts, you can, like I said, check out those vlogs. So I have The Last Stop on Market Street by Matt de la Pena, which I enjoyed. Love by Matt de la Pena, which made me cry. Carmilla Full of Wishes by Matt de la Pena, that was good. You Know How to Love by Rachel Towell Kenyon. All Because You Matter by Tammy Charles, which also made me cry. Fry Bread by Kevin Noble Maillard, and We Are Water Protectors by Carol Lindstrom. Now the thing with, definitely with Fry Bread, but to a lesser extent with We Are Water Protectors and All Because You Matter, they actually come with additional information. So you have the story, and then at the end of the book there's important information. I think in All Because You Matter, it's technically the author's note, but it goes over some of what is in the book. Fry Bread is the one that does this the most, where they he actually goes through and breaks it down section by section as to what it really means. So, it kind of makes it a good educational tool, not just a kid's book. And I think that it's really interesting that with all three of these, you get, like, the purpose behind why they wrote it, and also sometimes things like details of the pictures and things like that. And I thought that, on top of just the content of the stories, made those three books probably my favorite ones that I've read. Then I also read A Chair for My Mother by Vera Williams and Julian at the Wedding by Jessica Love. And then I also read Thank You, Omu by Oge Mora. This is the only one that I kind of had a problem with, and I didn't give it a star rating for that reason. Next, I read Taproot by Keezy Young, which was the group book for the Graphicathon. And it's about this boy who can see ghosts and befriends them. And this is specifically looking at his relationship with one of them, and they kind of fall in love. It's super sweet. I mostly wish that it was longer. I would definitely read a prequel or a sequel, and there were pieces of it that were a little bit rushed, but overall I really loved it. Next, I read another kid's book at work because it was slow, and that was I Promise by LeBron James. And this one was pretty okay. It was a pretty basic kid's book. I think that the majority of the ones that I've already listed were a bit more elevated than it, but, you know, it's not a bad kid's book. Then next, I finished Love Beyond Body, Space, and Time, which I started in October. And this was a really good anthology. This is a collection of short stories from LGBT plus Indigenous people. And there were so many really good stories. There were a couple that I would like to see expanded into whole books, and I'll definitely be checking out some of these authors' other works. If you want my specific thoughts on certain stories, I do talk about that a little bit in the vlogs that I've already mentioned. But overall, this was a really good time. I think I gave it 4 stars. Next, I finished Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis. And this was fantastic. This is a collection of mostly speeches and interviews with Angela Davis, and she's talking about how struggles for freedom globally are connected and how our social movements also need to be connected in order to get at all of those problems. And of course she's talking about like prisons and things like that. She's also talking about policing, and she also talks about how things like racism and sexism and transphobia are all also interlinked. It was a really great read, and it's making me really even more excited to read some of her other stuff that I have sitting on my shelf. To give you any idea, like, about the time that I had with this book, I marked so many things. I actually had a really good time figuring out how exactly I want to do some nonfiction, so I hope that I can continue applying this so that I can really use this in other situations, so that it'll be a lot easier to go back to it, and I could potentially use it in essays if I have an academic need for it, or just for easier revisiting. Next, I read The Pervert by Remy Boyd and Michelle Perez. And this is one that I had kind of a hard time figuring out my thoughts on. It's a graphic novel, and it explores the life of this trans sex worker. You get a look into her day-to-day and also her relationships, and it takes you on this journey throughout part of her life. Overall, the way that it was told, though, was very disconnected from each other. It felt like a bunch of scenes put together, and it was hard to know how much time had passed between each of them. So it made it sort of clunky. And I could see why they would decide to do that. Like, I could understand that artistic choice, but I don't think that I really got the way that they did it necessarily. Overall, there were a lot of good things in the story, but I thought that that piece of the storytelling just made it really hard to digest and really piece together all of it, because it definitely felt like there were a lot of things there thematically, but it was just a little hard to parse through. Editing Beck is here once again actually having to film the middle of this video because somehow the middle portion of it got corrupted because my camera breaks it up into individual files, and the middle file is just gone into the ether. So I hope you like this outfit because I've already filmed 2 other videos in it. So you're going to be seeing a lot of it. The next book that I read was another kid's book that I read at work called And Then the People Stayed Home by Kitty O'Meara. And it was a pretty nice, sweet kid's book. Very timely. It's about being in quarantine and, you know, why we have to do it. It's a nice, feel-good book that I think could explain things well for a child and make them feel comforted. So that's good stuff. After that, I read volumes 1 and 2 of Beyond the Clouds, The Girl Who Fell from the Sky by Nick, or Nicke. And this was just all around a really great time. This focuses in on this boy who lives in this world that definitely has fantasy elements, but you don't really know to what extent. There are different sorts of animals. No. There are different sorts of people who live in this world. Some of them kind of look like animals. And you have some rare people who have wings. And he finds a girl with wings who is injured. So he takes her in and ends up having to go kind of on this adventure in order to help her out. I started to read the first one at home, and then I brought it to work with me and finished it on my 15. And as soon as I finished it, I went and put book 2 on hold so that I could buy it after work. The next installment actually comes out this month, so I'm looking forward to that. After that, I read I'll Be Home for Christmas by Mason Deaver. This is a novella that follows up I Wish You All the Best, which is a story about Ben who comes out to their parents as non-binary, and they get kicked out of their house. The whole of I Wish You All the Best is basically them learning to accept themselves and accept love. In I'll Be Home for Christmas, they have graduated, and they are with... If you haven't read I Wish You All the Best, this might be a bit of a spoiler so far as who ends up with who. So maybe skip down until you don't see the cover anymore if you don't want spoilers. But in this, Ben is trying to pull off this Christmas surprise for Nathan, and it's really sweet and wonderful. After that, I finished The Wisdom of the Enneagram by Don Richard Rousseau and Russ Hudson. I've mentioned the Enneagram before, and I've read other Enneagram books, but I think this is actually the best introductory book that I've seen. I've read 3 books, so my sample size is pretty small. But this one has a balance of making things in a form that's really digestible, and actually telling you a lot about it. Because the very first one that I read had a decent amount of information, but it didn't, I think, lay it out as well as this one. And you also get pieces of, like, the history without having, like, this huge amount of information, which another one that I read that I still loved, granted, did that. But I think that if you are looking to start out in the Enneagram, this is going to be really great. It also comes with a quiz. Now, of course, you can get online Enneagram quizzes, but a lot of them are kind of different. It's really easy to get mistyped. I was actually mistyped. There were a few online tests that I took that said that I was a 2. I'm not a 2, I'm a 9. 9 with a 1 wing. And there are certain types of people who are frequently mistyped. I'm not going to get into all that because I'm not the best person to talk about the topic anyways. The whole point is, I read this. It was good. If you're interested in the Enneagram, go for it. I've really enjoyed the Enneagram and it's helped me a lot. Next, I read The Girl from the Other Side, Volume 2. I read the first volume a while back in a vlog, and I really loved it. The whole backdrop of it is very dark, fantasy, kind of apocalyptic, but the characters that you're following are super sweet and wholesome. This dark demon-looking guy is actually taking care of this little girl. They're both really sweet. I'm not going to say too much more just because I don't want to spoil anything. but I'm really loving this so far, and I'm looking forward to volume 3. After that, I read Anna on the Edge by AJ Sass. This is a middle grade book about an ice skater, a figure skater, who is questioning their gender. So you get to hear a lot about, like, ice skating, figure skating, what that's like, which was interesting. I had absolutely no background in ice skating. I am familiar with performing to a certain extent because I was definitely a band kid. So it was really neat to see those details, and also to see how, like, gender presents itself there too, just because that's a very, like, gendered sport. And I think the way that it handles gender and handles, like, talking about non-binary identity was really good. There's also a whole lot about relationships and communication between friends and between family members. There was a lot of really great stuff going on. I think I gave this one 4.5 stars. After that, I read Annie on My Mind by Nancy Garden. And this one I didn't have very high expectations for. It's an older YA. It was published in 1982. And I haven't had a ton of luck with older YA. We read a couple in my adolescent lit class, and they were, like, okay, but I really loved this one. There are pieces of it that are obviously dated. Like, if the author went to high school in 1970, this was published in 1980, of course it's not going to look the same. But the way that the love story is done is timeless in a lot of ways. So to give you a bit of the story, this is told from the perspective of Liza, but it's a few months or a year after the majority of the book has happened. So she's reflecting on it and trying to figure out what exactly happened and how she feels about it. And it talks about her meeting this girl, Annie. They start to have this friendship and fall in love. And a lot of other things happen in the school. There's definitely, like, homophobia and stuff like that that goes on. But like I said, the way that their love story is written, it was just beautiful and perfect in a lot of ways. It reminded me of certain things that I felt when I read Sappho. It also heavily reminded me of Ari and Dante, which, if y'all have been watching my videos, you know that I loved. There's just so much in here that's wonderful. Another big component of this is her working through her guilt. I feel like I'm repeating myself, and I talk about this in another video that I've already filmed that's going to come out, so if you hear me say this twice, sorry. But the way that they talk about her figuring out her guilt, I think, is very important. I am definitely glad that there are queer stories that don't have this, or I hope that there are going to be more queer stories that don't. But the reality for a lot of people who grow up in a heteronormative world is that you have a lot of guilt being queer. And the way that it ties in, the way that that internalized homophobia ties in with guilt around the rest of the situation, just gave me a lot of feelings. So I loved this book. If you were considering reading it, please do. Even though it is an older book, especially considering how young the genre of YA is, it is still relevant in a lot of ways, especially as a queer story. After reading that wonderful book that exceeded my expectations, I read a book that somehow managed to not meet up to my expectations that were already extremely low. I read Let It Snow by John Green, Maureen Johnson, and Lauren Miracle. So I didn't expect this to be the best ever. It was published a while back. I have read John Green, and I like most of John Green's stuff, but I'm not really familiar with the other two. I've heard some good things about Maureen Johnson, hadn't heard anything about the other author. Funnily enough, after I read this, I did hear some things about the other author, and none of them were good. So it's hilarious that she wrote the worst part of the book. But the whole premise of the book, you have 3 short stories that are all connected to each other. They all happen on the same day on Christmas, and the people in each of the stories know each other somehow. In the first short story, the main character has to get on a train to go to her grandparents' house on Christmas Eve because her parents ended up in jail because they got in a fight over Christmas decorations at the store. But her train gets stuck in the snow, so she ends up getting off the train and meeting somebody at the Waffle House. And she ends up going home to him and his mom, and a lot of stuff happens. I don't know how in detail I should really go because spoilers. But I thought that a lot of the way that things worked out in that story in particular were not that believable. There was stuff with her boyfriend that, like, I think the conversation on how mediocre men get away with doing the absolute bare minimum or really jack shit but can still be praised, like, I think that's a good conversation to have, and that was a part of it. But there was a lot of it that was just super unrealistic. And, like, if she had gone to the house of some random person that she met at a Waffle House in real life, she'd probably get murdered. But that's not even, like, the worst part. The first story was the best one. I think that was Maureen Johnson's story. The others I didn't read all the way through, which isn't the best, and I don't like doing that, but I just could not make myself do it. The second one, John Green's, this story focuses on some people who go to school with, the guy who worked at Waffle House and the guy that meets the main character of the first story. And this is around a group of friends, 3 friends, 2 guys and a girl, for the most part, and it's partly looking at the dynamic between 2 of the friends, who like each other. The reason that I couldn't get through this story had more to do with, like, the way that they talk to each other. And skimming it, I understand that part of the story addressed the way that they talk to each other, addresses the casual misogyny and kind of treating the girl as, like, one of the guys, but not in a way that's, like, actually good. So I understand that the short story addresses that, but I still couldn't deal with the banter. There was also, like, ableism and some, like, remarks about race that made me kind of uncomfortable. But the thing is, and the thing that actually made it worse was the fact that it felt exactly like some of those conversations would have happened when I was in high school. Like, if I had read this in 2008 when this was published, I probably would have found the second story really relatable because I knew nothing and the people around me knew nothing. So people said ignorant shit, and not all of the banter was totally bad, but just because of all of it and because of what I'm used to, it was so just viscerally cringy, and I don't like the word cringy. Like, people talk about people's interests being cringy, and I think that's just ridiculous. You can like what you like. But hearing conversations that are just, I don't know, maybe, it was 2008, I just couldn't. Like, even if it did resolve some of the stuff that was bad, I don't think that the short story format, first of all, was the way to go about that. Especially because there was a lot to unpack, and I don't think that he unpacks all of it from what I read. He does this in longer form with the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope and Looking for Alaska, and I actually enjoyed that. But I did not enjoy what he did in this. So that brings us to the last story, which focuses on a character that was dating one of the people that the girl from the first story met on the train. And the girlfriend, so the person in this story, had cheated on that person. And it was her story. I think that she tries to, like, get back with him. I'm not 100% sure. Like, at least with the second story, it was partly, like, a personal thing. Like, I just couldn't deal with reliving conversations between 15-year-olds in 2008 because I've already lived too many of those, right? But the third story was just bad. Like, the dialogue was bad. The character, I just did not give a single shit about. And at this point, after reading a not that great story and then a story that I couldn't get through, if you're giving me a shittier character than all of the other stuff that I've read, I'm not going to give a single fuck. And that's what happened. And she, like, tries to solve this problem that she created herself, and, like, listening to her try to justify it was, like, I just couldn't do it. I read less than half of it. I read more of the second one than I did of the last one. I just couldn't do it. And like I've already mentioned, after reading this, I heard some things about that third author. And it just is really funny. Apparently, well, it's not funny, but it's funny that hers is the shittiest story in here. Meanwhile, in the year of our Lord 2020, she was saying something about straight white boys not having enough representation, which is completely laughable. Extra funny because the main guy in her story also was, like, Native American, which is super suspect. I didn't read the details of her story long enough, honestly, to really be able to pick apart what the representation was like, because I was already developing a migraine. But it's probably for the best that I didn't. She's also got some kind of racist depictions of people in some of her more recent stuff, too. I'm not going to subject you to the exact wording that I saw in the tweet. But needless to say, I kind of regret reading this. There was nothing redeeming about it. I bought it forever ago when I was super into John Green. And I want to reiterate, I do like some of his books. This isn't like, oh, like, look how shitty this is, because people tend to do that. But, like, this was just a bad book. I know that he can write better than that. I've heard good things about some of Maureen Johnson's more recent stuff. The last authors probably don't bother with it all. So, that's Let It Snow, and I'm glad that's not the last book that I read this year. The next book that I read was by the other Green brother. I read An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This is a sci-fi story. Our main character, April, notices what appears to be a really large robot. She assumes that it's some sort of sculpture, and one of her friends films her with it. It turns out that this was not just a sculpture, and that tons of them in a lot of other cities around the world all showed up just at the same time. There's no evidence of how they got there. So throughout the book, they're trying to figure out where they came from, what they are, what purpose do they serve. So there's that, like, sci-fi part of the plot, but I think really the point is looking at the character of April, who goes viral overnight. This is one of the first videos of one of these robots, called the Carls, because she decided to name it Carl. So that should tell you how big the video got. But she has to contend with this newly found, very quickly found fame and social media notoriety, and how she deals with that. I think in the first half of the book, the look into the character was way more interesting than the plot, but as it went on, it was kind of even in that regard. I am super stoked to read the second part of it, because I think that it will give us a lot. You know, obviously it continues the story, so we know what happens next. But so far as, like, the look into fame and social media, I am really fascinated. I actually want to do a reread of this just to reflect on it and think about the different things that Hank would be pointing out if we look at, like, probably 2015 to 2017, which I would imagine would be around the times that he would have come up with the idea and started writing this, because it was published in 2017 or 2018. 2018. So it'll be interesting to see maybe what all he was talking about or looking at with this, and it will also be super interesting to see what else goes into the sequel, because a lot happened in 2018 and 19 in terms of social media and people in power using social media. So it'll be interesting to see what all he included in that. So I definitely gave this 5 stars. The look into the character by itself was enough to draw me in, but also the plot got really good. Enough for me to immediately buy the sequel the next day. The final book that I finished in 2020 was Gender Queer, edited by Ricky Wilchins and a few other folks as well. This is an anthology of essays on gender, on people who queer gender. This includes, of course, people who are genderqueer. It also includes essays by binary trans people, intersex people, and people who queer gender with their sexuality in a variety of ways. This was originally published in 2002, but they re-released it for Kindle, I think around August of this past year, and it has just so much valuable stuff in it. It really opens up the conversation about what queerness is, what gender is, in so many different ways. And I really think that in some ways it should be essential reading. I do not think that it is the first thing that you should read. Absolutely not. Just because it would confuse people who have never had to look at queerness before. But I think especially if you are LGBT or you are interested especially in just conversations about identity, I think that this is really important because we are still having some of these same conversations now. In particular, the last essay, which is written by Ricky Wilchins, they really go into it, and excluding the stuff that is more specific terminology and maybe a couple of details about culture towards the beginning, it could have been written today. In terms of talking about the fact that, you know, having a growing understanding of sexuality and gender isn't indicative of anything negative. That is the trajectory of things when people are more liberated in terms of gender. You get more diversity. And they also say a lot of really intense things in that essay looking at violence and how focusing on a lot of this difference as a bad thing definitely does nothing to solve that violence and can even perpetuate it in certain ways. I thought that it was just a really wonderful thing to wrap it up with. Another one of my favorite essays was definitely Sylvia Rivera's. She talks a lot about just her experiences in the LGBT community, both positive and negative. There's a lot of really intense stuff in this book, so definitely proceed with caution when looking at this, because a lot of it is people sharing the trauma of being forced into a framework that simply does not work with who they are. There's also a fair amount of abuse, sexual assault, a lot of slurs. Some of them are reclaimed, but some of them are them talking about them being used as slurs against them. There's also one story in particular that deals with child abuse and incest. That's called My Life. It's kind of in the middle of it. I expected there to be discussion of trauma and stuff like that, and I also expected a lot of the kind of explicit sexual content, but I was not expecting child abuse. But overall, I thought this was a really great and important essay collection. And I would definitely recommend it to people who are really looking heavily at the LGBT community. So, those are the last things that I read in the final 2 months of 2020. There's a small chance that I could finish another book. There are technically a few more hours left. I also started a few other things during November and December as well. I started a couple of things for the Tome Topple, so I guess I'll start with that. I was planning to read How to Survive a Plague by David France. And this is on my HIV and AIDS TBR, but I DNF'd it. I do plan on picking it back up, so it's not a permanent DNF. But there were just some details that made me think that I need to be reading this more critically than I was originally anticipating. Of course, with any book, I'm going to go in and, like, if something problematic or fishy comes up, I'm going to note it. I don't remember 100% of the things that I saw, but there was enough that it made me put it down. I think it very, like, is super obviously coming from a white gay man's perspective, which is not bad. Obviously, a lot of white gay men were impacted by this. But I mean that in that there's going to be that bias, especially, like, looking at someone who is more well off and white. He's at least somewhat conscious of it, but there's still some stuff that makes this seem iffy in some regards. There were also some things that were just really off-putting on top of that. Like, for instance, he described an anti-gay hate crime and then called the person who committed it a madman, which, you know, fair enough. I could see that as, like, a negative word. On top of, like, ableism and stuff like that, it also is dismissive of the hate crime. He wasn't somebody who was, like, actively having delusions or something like that. He was someone who hated someone so much that he wanted to hate crime them. So little, like, details like that, I was just not in the mood to deal with it. I think that reading Moving Politics before this also put my brain in a more analytical mode to be looking out for certain things, because I saw what some of the issues were between some of the different groups. So I will read this, and I do think that it's going to have some helpful stuff, but there's just some stuff that seems a little suspect. So another thing that I started for the Tome Topple was Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I have really enjoyed it so far. I was actually listening to the audiobook at the same time that I was reading it, and that was really great so far. I got a little less than 100 pages in, and I do plan on continuing this. I actually ended up buying a copy for my mom because I thought she would like it too. So this is really wonderful, and if you can listen to the audiobook, that's really wonderful as well. So this is going to be something great to bring into 2021. Now, another nonfiction that I started was The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby, and this is looking at racism in the church, specifically racism in the American church, and how Christianity enabled a lot of the racist stuff that happened in the United States. So it talks a lot about history, and it even goes into some of the theological parts of it as well. I think this is going to be a super important read, and it's one that I'm still kind of in the middle of. I haven't picked it up in a couple of weeks, but I'm still really anticipating it. And then the final book that I started but have not quite finished, 30 Names of Night by Zain Jukadar. This book focuses on a closeted Syrian trans man who is dealing with the loss of his mother and also dealing with other family stuff, but he ends up finding the journals of this person who lived around them. I know that there's going to be some discussion of, like, looking at, like, queer ancestry, like the other people who were in his culture who were queer. So it's really beautiful so far. I love the writing style. I'm not all that far into it, but not for lack of interest. I just know that it's going to be really intense, especially with a lot of the themes of loss and grief and things like that. So I'm also really, really looking forward to being able to finish this next year. So that is all that I have. That's what I read in November and December. If you have read any of these, definitely let me know your thoughts about them down in the comments. And thank you all so much for watching. Bye.